I've never really finished a campaign of Dungeons & Dragons. I've DM'd for nearly 4 years and started 5 long-term campaigns, each with aspirations for the characters to reach high levels, fight monumental threats, and live to tell the tale. But none of them ever did. In fact, last month my most recent campaign joined the pile of unfinished campaigns I've left in my wake. I'm here to tell you what went wrong and what you can do to avoid the same fate. So let's start with the worst problem all of my campaigns have been afflicted with, the one even the most skilled of dungeon masters shakes in fear at the sight of. Scheduling conflicts. Many have said the true villain of a D&D adventure is scheduling the time to play the damn adventure, and I'm going to throw my hat in with them. Sticking to a reliable time each week or even month for everyone in your group to gather at the table and play is incredibly difficult. For my group, work schedules shifted, big events came up, and emergencies had to be dealt with. I thought my group, which was dedicated to meeting every week, would avoid all of that. So I did not lay out a plan of action to address scheduling conflicts, and oh boy did missing weeks or even months of sessions at a time really take its toll. Of course, there was only so much I could do about scheduling conflicts. People get new jobs with new hours, they get tickets to exciting concerts, they get sick, that's life. But make no mistake, there were things I could have done that you should try and do too. Number 1, have a solid foundation. As a group, agree on an exact time, place, duration, and frequency at which you play your campaign or D&D in general. This can be 6 to 10 p.m. Saturday nights at Jim's house, or 8 hours every third Wednesday of the month on Roll20. Or when night falls and the full moon rises, we meet in the forest thicket beyond the realm of man till morning light, and Xanther brings cookies. Keep in mind, a session isn't going to be just playing D&D. My group liked catching up a bit before playing and needed breaks every 90 minutes or so. That additional time should be planned for in each session's duration. I also think you need a bit of time at the end for reflecting on the session, but I'll explain that later. The idea here is for people to play around D&D instead of having D&D only happen when there's a communal schedule gap. Furthermore, if your group agrees to this schedule, you should only need to discuss it again when one or more people have scheduling conflicts. The rest of the time you can go completely silent between sessions and still expect people to show up to play. Though I suggest reminding people at least the day before or the morning of each session, since we are forgetful creatures, we only have 10 average intelligence after all. Number 2, plan for conflicts. When scheduling conflicts come up, and they will come up, you need to be prepared as a group to handle them. My group never explicitly made plans on what to do when someone had a scheduling conflict. So when someone did, we just canceled the session altogether. This, in my opinion, was a huge mistake. If player 1 can't make it to session 1, player 2 can't make it to session 2, and player 3 has an emergency right before session 3, you are looking at a campaign dying before it even begins. You need to work with your group to have a plan ready for when someone can't make it, but everyone else still wants to play. What happens to a missing player's character when that player can't make a session? What if more than one player can't make a session? What if the dungeon master can't make a session? Having answers to all of these questions prepares the group and the campaign to survive a few scheduling hits instead of collapsing under the first conflict. Though you should still fear the holiday season, because that's when my campaigns usually went right into a freezer. Number 3, guess a campaign's length. As a group, agree on the length of an entire campaign. This can be a rough number of sessions or a date in the future. People need to know if they're committing to a 2-year-long epic or a one-shot or anything in between. Blocking out Saturday morning as D&D time for 2 years can immediately make some people question how much they really want to play. Do your best to make the length and attendance expectations of your campaign clear to the group. The length of a campaign can change depending on what happens in the game, so discuss this again as needed. Even with those 3 points completed, the war against scheduling conflicts will be fought for however long your campaign goes. The best you can do is win more battles than you lose. Before we move on to the second big failing of my campaign, please like this video to deal 1 damage to Venom Fang, the Dragon of Thunder Tree. If the dragon is defeated, you can rummage through their treasure hoard to find a magic axe. Neat. Now, let's move on to the second nail in my campaign's coffin. Who cares? I was 20 sessions into my newest campaign, which was based on the official adventure Curse of Strahd, before I realized none of the player characters had any reason to want to fight Strahd. Sure, they all had some cards read to them that said they might be able to do it, and they had encountered him a few times and he seemed spooky, but none of the characters had goals that Strahd was stopping them from achieving, or even hated the guy. This entire campaign is supposed to lead up to killing Strahd, and none of the players or characters felt much of anything about the guy. This is not a good place to be as a DM. D&D and other tabletop RPGs are not a novel. They are not a video game. They are not the dungeon master scripting a story and the other players acting it out using their characters. D&D is a group storytelling game, so the entire group at the table needs to care about the story being told. The DM usually cares. They made most, if not all, the world and play many key roles in the story, be it villain, monster, guide, or ally. But players often only have one way to care about the story being told: their character. Which means if their character has no reason to care about the story, the player usually isn't going to care either. To ensure this does not happen, the Dungeon Master should do their best to work with other players to incorporate their characters into the ongoing events of the story, which I failed to do the entire campaign. But as the great robot Genji once said,
"You are only human."
So it can be incredibly difficult to find out what a player and their character cares about. Fortunately, you have a few ways to find out. Let's go easiest to hardest, starting with 1. A player probably cares about whatever they write down. That means whatever is on their character sheet and their character's backstory. This can include their character's ideals, bonds, flaws, flavor text they add to mundane equipment, non-player characters from their backstory, and so on. If possible, get a copy of all these things and highlight key components you want to bring into this story. The world of the adventure can bend to fit what players care about. On the other hand, if there is nothing in a character's construction or backstory you think can be incorporated into the campaign, ask a player to change a few details. I have found that the best characters are written with the adventure in mind, and the best adventures written with characters in mind. This is a symbiotic relationship, and you cannot fully make one without some idea of what the other will be. Most important to this character-story relationship is ensuring a player character has a reason to be on this particular campaign's adventure. Otherwise, you'll find that the player has nothing to fuel their roleplay or interactions with the world from. Number 2, do your best to find out what a player cares about during the session. If you introduce an NPC from a player character's backstory, how did that character's player react to that NPC? Did the player and the rest of the party talk to that NPC for only a few moments, or happily talk for a dozen minutes? When you said a player character's rival is sneaking around town, did that player urge the group to investigate, or just acknowledge it as passing information? A good marker of interest is purely how long players choose to interact with something. The longer they choose to talk to someone, investigate a mystery, or march around a place, the higher the likelihood they care about it. But you can never be sure by just watching what players do, so you need the hardest part. Number 3, gather feedback after the session. This has been very difficult for me to do throughout my time as a DM, and has been to my game's detriment. When you stop playing D&D, most people assume the group is done hanging out. This is especially true for online games, which my most recent campaign was, since everyone can just hop off the call with a press of the button. You need to change this habit if you want a better game. As I alluded to earlier, when talking about scheduling the duration of your sessions, time to reflect on the recently finished session and just hang out should be incorporated into whatever time slot you have for your game, or at least should be incorporated every few times you play. To begin this part of a session, move to a new area to physically segment the D&D part from the hanging out part. Online, this can be achieved by closing your virtual tabletop and moving to a different voice channel in a Discord perhaps. During that time, players can give each other feedback, and you can ask a few questions about the session. Make sure your questions are direct. Do you like the session? Or did you have fun? Are truly terrible. Not just because the answer will always be, yeah, but because everyone can have fun, yet recognize where improvements can be made. There are a ton of ways you can get good feedback. You can ask, hey, I introduced that guy from your backstory and you guys seem to talk with him a lot. What was your favorite thing about him? Or, that encounter with the wolves felt really low energy at the table. What wasn't fun about that encounter? Use specific examples from the session and ask questions that can't be easily answered with just yes or no. If your group finds that type of questioning too confrontational, or really don't have time to hang out after a session, set up a way for other players to text the DM feedback. Perhaps a group text the day after the session asking everyone for at least 1 spotlight and 1 star. Spotlights being something the players remember being interesting from the session, and stars being something they hope to see in the next session, like more combat or that black powder merchant you made up. Whatever feedback a player gives you, try to resist the urge to become defensive. I need at least a few minutes, if not a few hours, to accept players' feedback with an open mind instead of making excuses for why they should have liked something. Thank them for their feedback, mull it over, and then figure out whether you should implement it or not. D&D is often about compromise, so don't forget about your own enjoyment when trying to make the game better for everyone else. As a bonus, which is totally optional, every few months, ask players what they are currently doing in their free time besides D&D. Many people read books, watch shows, play video games, and play other tabletop games. Steal concepts from whatever they bring up. The media your players like is a great place to find things they'll like in the game. Just don't try and consume all the media they talk about unless you got a lot of time. Steal concepts by reading plot synopses online, watching major scenes, or looking at concept art. Okay, you fought the scheduling war and won, for now, while at the same time you've incorporated things your players seem to like and find interesting in the game. Both things I failed to do in my last campaign. On to the final nail in my campaign's coffin: online is different. Playing Dungeons & Dragons through a virtual tabletop like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds is different than playing at a physical table with physical dice. You need to know that going into it, otherwise you'll end up like me, being completely unprepared for the different set of challenges online D&D has. When playing online, you need to know that 1. Tech support will happen. Someone's internet will cut out. Someone's mic will stop working. Your custom Discord music bot will just start playing random club music instead of your neatly organized D&D playlist. You have to accept that these are just part of the game online. Otherwise, you'll be put in a bad mood whenever they happen. Solve them as quickly as possible, pause the game as needed, and even continue on without a player, noting your condolences to their shitty internet service provider. Number 2, attention can be hard to catch and maintain online. Your online sessions might need more action, wilder NPCs, or a shorter duration to keep everyone engaged. You might need to shift focus from player to player more often than at a physical table, so no one begins to drift away because they are just staring at their screen. I recommend everyone in your group get a fidget toy to have on hand to ward off attention deficits. These lapses in attention may be alleviated if each player cares a lot about the story unfolding in front of them. Number 3, clear communication is vital. Unless everyone in the group is running full video and audio, which your internet or conferencing software may not like, you will not be able to read body language and visual cues. On top of that, audio delays mean you will probably talk over someone that just started talking or had just taken a pause before continued to talk. Combined, these can mean a lot of confusion and misunderstandings at the table. To combat this, repeat information, confirm what people meant, explain things in new ways, anything and everything to help people know what is going on. I think I did this so poorly. I realized I should be putting more effort into this even when in person where I can see people's faces. Number 4, just like the mechanics of D&D, virtual tabletops have a learning curve. So do your best to learn as fast as possible instead of wasting precious session time figuring things out. By the end of my campaign, none of us knew how to properly select multiple monsters for a spell or an effect in Fantasy Grounds. If I just practiced a few times, I could have shared that knowledge with everyone else and saved a lot of wasted session time individually applying effects to monsters. Learning as much as possible about your VTT of choice also means you quickly discover what you need to prepare within the VTT. For example, official content in Fantasy Grounds is not that easy to edit. So if I want the party to run into werewolves with homebrew defenses and attacks, it's going to take some time to copy that official stat block and type up those new effects. Time the players get to spend staring blankly at their screen. Try to do as much technical prep as possible outside the session. That means building monster stat blocks, uploading maps to your campaign folders, and so on. Also, maybe just accept that official monsters are good enough and you can just vary up their tactics or personalities to make them do whatever you want. Those are the reasons my most recent campaign died and what I would improve so that campaigns will live in the future. If this has inspired you to run a new, better campaign, perhaps you'll find that new campaign in this playlist of official adventures. Have a nice day. Try not to die in a TPK. Goodbye.